Then welcome to this event from the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl and I will be today's moderator. But more important than this is today's speaker and his topic, which is Arthur Chapman, with the topic, what is school history for? Problems and possibilities. We are very happy to have Arthur and his topic here, and we are also honored, obviously. I want to introduce Arthur shortly. I mean, many of you know him already, I'm sure. But Arthur is Associate Professor in History Education at the University College of London. He has also been a history teacher before he became a university. He was a history teacher before he became a university researcher. He is also the managing editor of, I need to read it correctly, History Education Research Journal, and the director of the international blog journal, Public History Weekly. In his capacity as the latter, he most recently edited the February issue of Public History Weekly, which was an issue on history education in a climate crisis, which I read and which I can wholeheartedly recommend to anybody who's interested in the Anthropocene discussion, which is currently sort of popping up in a lot of different venues, and sort of a lot of different disciplines have taken interest in it. Arthur has also most recently edited a book, which is called Knowing History in Schools, Powerful Knowledge and the Powers of Knowledge, which I also encourage you to have a look at. But equally, we are also very happy and honored to have Arthur here for the topic. History education and curriculum studies have engaged with philosophy and theory of history in recent times a lot, but unfortunately, there has not been much engagement the other way around. And we believe this really is a missed opportunity. In the philosophy of history and the theory of history, there recently has sort of been a discussion that we don't know enough about historiography, or historiography as a subject and as a sort of object in schools as well. And we don't know enough about what variably has been called history culture or historical culture. Likewise, in more theoretical discussions around post-narrativism or naturalism, there's been the call for something like a practical turn, so turn towards actual disciplinary practices of historiography, and also towards historiography as a discipline in a social sense, so for something like towards a sociology of historiography, or a sociology of history, culture, and historical thinking, if you like. And we believe that insights from history education and curriculum studies are central to all those discussions, and therefore we are very happy and honored that we can listen to Arthur on this topic today. So before I give the word already to Arthur, already two small things still. First, technicalities. Obviously, after Arthur's talk, there will be a discussion. If you want to speak up or have a question, please write first so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera, or you can write your question or comment in the chat, and then I will read it out. We will also we will also prioritize people who haven't spoken yet, so they will be put on top of the speakers list. And also, when the whole event is finished, we, the people of the center, and Arthur will stay on a bit longer for a more informal chat. So if you're more interested in the activities of the center, or more interested in anything that has been said more informally, please, you're very welcome to stay on. Okay, but that's now enough of me. Please, Arthur, thank you.
I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, and it's very exciting for me to be engaging with your centre. I'm very aware of the work that you do, and of some of the books that your colleagues in the centre have published, which I found very inspiring and interesting to read. And I also follow the Journal of Philosophy of History with great interest as well. So it's a real privilege to be here. I also I'm suffering from imposter syndrome a little bit, because I wouldn't claim to be a philosopher, but anyway, I'll do my best, and thank you so much for the opportunity. So this is what I'm going to talk about, and I've talked about this a lot actually over the years, and thought about it quite a lot, the whole question of what school history is for. And I think that we need to change what it's for, and to expand the possibilities that can arise through school history. But we also need to be very aware of the problems that we will face if we try and do that. Hopefully I'll have something to say about both of them. My intention was to cover these points, which is the abstract that you may have seen on the website, to try and bring together a curriculum theory, thinking theory of history, and what an interesting idea that is. And I'm going to really try and argue for the expansion of what we do in school history in the light of engagement with contemporary theory of history, which I think, I don't know if it's just me, but seems to me to be a time of renaissance in theory of history. There's some amazing work going on, which I find extremely exciting. So, okay, let's get going. What is school history? What can it be? I mean, the answer is as many things as you like. It's highly contested, just like history in Galli's terms was essentially contested. So also with school history, there are many things that go under this name. Just to show you a couple of examples, these come things I picked up in a study I was working on that my institution was involved in about 6 or 7 years ago now. And this was an attempt to look at curriculum in different countries and see if differences in curriculum might explain PISA rankings. In America, they're very concerned. They were quite low down the international rankings in the Programme for International Assessment. And they wanted to know whether curriculum was the answer. So they paid my colleagues and I to go and study curriculum documents in 11 countries and try and say something sensible on that basis. You couldn't say much sensible on that basis, I'm afraid, but it was interesting to look. So here is one example. This is the History and Social Science Curriculum Framework from Massachusetts. And yeah, what have we got here? And by the way, please do interrupt me if you want to, but things that strike me about it is we've got a national political instrumentalization of history. We're using history here to transmit a political vision from one generation to the other in the context of America. That's what I mean by national political. It's also really rather ahistorical, it seems to me. There's no notion of historicity here. There is this vision of the founders, which can simply be passed on intact, as if, looking through the founders' vision won't mean different things as the landscape of time shifts and so on. But anyway, we've got an ahistorical national political notion here. And it's also actually functionalist in sociological terms. It assumes that one can achieve national cohesion of some kind through values consensus, I think. Something like that's going on anyway, which is quite interesting. And in Johan Roosen's terms, we talk about traditional historical consciousness here. You live well, according to this model, when you live as your great ancestors did. So that's one vision of school history, kind of national political, ahistorical, traditional, and functionalist sociologically. Here's another one very different. This is the Finnish one. I haven't checked actually if this is still current now, but this is some text from the Finnish curriculum 2004, and extremely different, I think you'd agree. Just looking at it, what have we got? It focuses on individuals. Maybe I'm going too far when I say this, but it struck me reading it just now that it was more civic humanist than civic republican. It's about individuals and their rights and their perspectives. We have agency given to pupils. The point here is to empower them. So, for example, help them become responsible players. Towards the end, helping them, giving them materials with which they can build their identities. So there's a lot of agency here for pupils. And it's quite critical. They're asked to be critical. The word is there in the end of the first sentence, I think. They think about things critically. But there's also pluralism, because we have cultures in the plural. We have process and various other things which are thought of as being plural. So this is not about transmitting some fixed, national message which doesn't vary over time. It seems to me to be about individuals and about their construction of their position in time. I would call it a kind of very much historical consciousness type approach as well, thinking in Johan Roosen's terms, familiarizing themselves with the concept of time and things like that. There's probably a lot more going on here that I don't recognize. The value of mental and material work, I'm intrigued by that, and I know Finnish colleagues will know more about that than I do. But my point so far is very different visions of history are possible. Just to continue on elaborating different visions, here is an extract from a debate that took place in the British Parliament a while ago now, but I usually use it as a very striking example of a kind of political visions of history. So the person proposing that the law be changed to mandate more history teaching, more British history teaching, of course, says this kind of thing. So the peoples of these magnificent British Isles, it begins, have a rich and proud history like no other. And at the end, we have the depth and the breadth of our history is unsurpassed. So I think what I get from this immediately is a kind of nationalism, a celebration of the nation, and also what people now have learnt, particularly since Brexit, to really recognise British exceptionalism, this notion that, you know, we are like no other, unsurpassed and unique in some way. And you know, maybe these are connected. Maybe this kind of way of talking about the past has consequences. But anyway, if we then look in the middle, not the beginning and the end, what kind of past do we have? Stonehenge, St. Paul's Cathedral, so religious monuments, I guess. Battles, Agincourt, Trafalgar, Waterloo, Falklands, the Spanish Armada. So we've got massive buildings, impressive religious artifacts. We win lots of battles, and we create steam engines and discover penicillin. So there's a kind of vision here, which is, I suppose, broad. It's not simply, you know, drums and trumpets and militarism. That we've got culture, we've got science, but we have imperialism and various other things. He carries on with a notion quite like the American one, actually, we just saw from Maryland, I think it was, wasn't it? So what we must do is celebrate and pass on and carry on what our ancestors did. So, you know, he says every young person can grow up with an appreciation and an understanding of all that has made our nation great throughout the centuries. So all that has made our nation great throughout the centuries is a given. Children are to come to know and understand that. So I would say that's to do with the transmitting of a fixed narrative, and that it positions children in relation to it in quite a passive way. They aren't there to construct the narrative or to decide what it all means, as was the case in the Finnish curriculum document, but they are to receive this transmitted thing. And I think it's quite similar to the American one. It seems to me, going towards the end of it, you know, they were in turn, having studied this story, they will feel able to carry it on. So there's a transmission of the virtues of the national story, which kids appreciate and understand. They do not have any active role. And what's really interesting to me is the opposition. So this MP for the Conservative Party, who at that time were not the government, stood up and advocated all of this. He wanted more of that. And here is what the government in power replied with, which is quite intriguing. Because we have consensus about form and dissensus about content. So British history should be made a core subject. Every young person can grow up with an appreciation of it, and things like that is what the Conservative was saying. But what does the Labour representative say? They agree, we have a proud history, and this history should be told to the kids. So it is a fixed narrative which, as it were, can be read to the kids. They simply listen, presumably. So we have complete consensus on what history is. A national narrative, a fixed narrative, which we transmit to the coming generations. But the narrative is just different. What we have here is history from below, if you like. This is what Eric Hobsbawm called, in a way, the forward march of Labour, perhaps. It's certainly about protest and revolt. The Levellers, the Diggers, these are revolutionaries, radicals from the English Revolution, or the Civil War, depending what you want to call it. Peterloo, Tolpoddle Martyrs, that's the trade union movement. So another vision of school history then is, or maybe it's the same actually as the Maryland one. It's a kind of a positive story, and if you like, a national myth, and children are simply passively to listen to it. Well, the good news is that what politicians want and what actually happens is often a different thing. This is something we understand as students of history. I've been very struck, for example, studying both Stalin and Hitler, by the fact that even in dictatorships, policy is always mediated. And what the Politburo or the Führer wish is never really what happens in the end, because everything gets reinterpreted at every level of a system. And policies actually come out at the end in a different form from what the input was at the beginning. So regardless of what politicians want to achieve in the curriculum, they have to work with other people, and they have to confront the realities of teaching and learning. And the other people that they work with have traditions of their own. And we can see a very different vision here, actually, in the Conservative curriculum from 2013. And it's because it's shaped by many hands. In fact, I'm willing to almost put name labels on different parts of it. I would say this curriculum document, and I think it's true of many curriculum documents, are heteroglossic in Bakhtin's terms. There's more than one voice here. More than one person has written different components of it. More than one discourse is drawn upon. But you can see quite a lot here, I think, can't we? We can see a desire for a coherent knowledge and understanding of Britain's past. Interesting that, isn't it? It's the past, not the history, unless they don't understand the difference between the past and history, or between the things as they actually happened and the records we have left of them and the narratives people spin. But anyway, there's a desire for coherent knowledge here of Britain and also the wider world. So it's not just Anglo-centric. There's hints here of a disciplinary approach. The children have agency, not as in that the two politicians in 2009, not as in the case of Maryland, because they are asking questions. They are equipped to weigh evidence, to sift arguments. So there's definitely a disciplinary thing there. But there's also, I would call it a kind of aesthetic, really. There's a desire to inspire curiosity and a desire to know, the kind of mystery and the attraction of the past. So there's a different discursive feature there as well, maybe. The coherent story, the curiosity, the criticality, quite a lot going on. And I'm also struck by plurality. So complexity, people's lives, plural. Diversity of societies, plural. Relationships, plural. Different groups, plural. Sorry, I can't speak now. So that's interesting, isn't it? It's not the transmission of a single coherent narrative, which is kind of what it sort of suggests in the first line. We've got plurality towards the end, even though we had singularity at the beginning, which I think is a bit strange, isn't it? But also shows, I think, the heteroglossia here. Also as well, I mean, maybe I'm overinterpreting it, the kids are coming to understand their identity. That perplexes me. I'm wondering whether they create it, as was the case in the Finnish curriculum, or whether their identity is understood as fixed and given, and they simply come to understand it. In a way, it doesn't really matter. You can't tell, can you? But it's intriguing. Let's go into some of the detail. And this is what I mean by heteroglossia. So this is a list of aims. Now, the first thing about it is they aren't actually aims. So this shows how a curriculum framework is created by the curriculum makers in government and then populated in different ways in different subjects. A lot of these things really aren't aims. They're more to do with, medium-term objectives or things you would actually do. A lot of them are only tacitly saying what the point of it all is. I mean, the first thing, for example, we want them to come away understanding, quote, the history of these islands, which is already giving me pause for thought. The history, there's one story of these islands, plural entities. We are to understand this as a coherent chronological story, a narrative rather. Now, to me, that's a politician's aim. I don't think you get a historian thinking that was even achievable. How can there be one story of plural islands over millennia? What is it on earth? What on earth is it that might provide the coherent narrative thread throughout all this time? I think, and I hope it's not just me, but that has me scratching my head as a historian. But then if you look further down, let's say the fourth and the fifth and the sixth, you very rapidly get into what I would call a disciplinary set of aims as well. And those are in contradiction to this desire for a single story. The a single story desire takes us back to those politicians in that debate. They just couldn't agree what the story was, refuting the idea there could be a single one, of course. But the final three bullet points here point to plurality again. So let's take the penultimate one. Understand the methods of historical inquiry. Methods, plural, for a start. So there are going to be different answers if you have different methods. We've then got claims, plural, not singular. We have arguments, plural, interpretations, plural. So the idea there could be one story is in some tension with that, and that is, I think, disciplinary. Really interestingly as well, if you look in the third from the bottom of these aims, we have quite a lot of agency for the kids. So they are going to come and understand all these historical concepts, continuity, change, cause, and so on. And they are going to make connections, draw contrasts, analyze trends, frame questions. These kids have lots of agency. And furthermore, they're going to create their own accounts, plural. On the one hand, then, they are to digest this singular narrative. On the other hand, they are going to make their own stories, plural. I think this is interesting. It shows you lots of different things at once, and it shows you the way in which all policy documents, really, in democracies, but certainly curriculum documents, unless they are created by a unitary body that are containing people only of one mind, tend to be rather contradictory in interesting ways. And of course, going back to Stalin and Hitler and how politics works in dictatorships, let alone democracies, where presumably there's even more of this, all these documents are, of course, interpreted on the ground, and the outcomes are going to be quite plural and different as well. But yeah, we're just keeping on with our visions of school history then. And just to show you the British school curriculum, sorry, the English school curriculum, because of course Britain has 4 nations in it, at least 5 if you include the Cornish. What is it all about, this curriculum? Let's just have a look at the headings. So the development of church and state in medieval Britain, the development of church and state in society in Britain in what we call the early modern period, I suppose. Ideas, political power, industry and empire, Britain 1745 to 1901. That's interesting, isn't it? So the first 3 give you church and state, don't they? And then the next one is history of ideas, history of politics, but also history of empire, also history of industry. So that's interesting in terms of becoming more diverse over time, at least in the headings. Keeping going, we've got challenges for Britain and Europe and the wider world. So it's moving beyond Britain to Europe. And interestingly, then we have some things that are on the end, which you can choose. So if you look at the last bullet point, this is where the world, if you like, comes into its own. Now, what strikes me about this, and I think a good way of answering that question is to ask the different question, which is what's missing? So in this curriculum, we've got a lot of Europe, we've got a lot of England, we don't have much of the world. It's quite Eurocentric and Anglo-centric, I would say. Even though there are mentions of things like the Enlightenment, and there are social things on this page, for example, social, cultural, technological change in post-war Britain. Nevertheless, I would think it's quite a narrow account of history. There's nothing here, let's say, that would allow you to realise there was something called the Holocene. You wouldn't know from this curriculum that the last 10,000 years in which civilization has been possible because of the spread of farming were characterized by certain environmental conditions which were not present before. You wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know either, for example, anything very much about Africa. All there is in here that goes beyond Eurasia and the Americas, really, is a reference to the slave trade. And there's one reference, I think, to China. But again, we're not getting into Africa, we're not getting into Oceania. There's quite a lot missing in terms of the world, there's quite a lot missing in terms of time. And the basic framing of it is British in orientation, and secondly, Eurocentric. So again, though, we have to bear in mind that school teachers will interpret this in their own ways, and many school teachers are pushing the envelope. So there's been great work done on African kingdoms, for example, in England recently, just to give one example. Okay, what can we say about how this will be implemented in practice? Now, Alison Kitson's with us here today. Hello, Alison, again. But I'm going to make a reference to some work that Alison and I did with Catherine Byrne, and we published in 2018. This is some indication of how teachers might interpret all of this, because you can't just talk about a curriculum and what it means without talking about the people who are going to implement it. We did a study asking our students, teachers, 40 of them, to debate school history and its purposes. And we came up with a coding system analysing what they were saying. So here are some of the sorts of things they were saying. Some of them were saying, a really important thing in school history. I'm just getting where I can see it because the video is over it there, is knowledge and understanding of the past. So for example, one of them said, an interest in the past and a desire to increase knowledge and understanding of the past is a good thing. So some of them thought that. Many of them advocated disciplines, and you've got a quote there giving an example. Developing increased awareness of the nature of how evidence is used to support a claim, very disciplinary. Some of them talked about historical consciousness, at least that's how we coded it. So they're talking about time in the dark green at the bottom there. Really quickly, just to give you some other examples of the sorts of things that they mentioned. Intellectual maturity, we want children to develop history is demanding, it sharpens their minds. General skills were mentioned, which is the kind of thing that governments talk about a lot. Fascination, aesthetic appeal, we called it, when people said things like history should be about engaging with the past, with excitement and the beauty of history. We also had what I would call more politicians' aims. So the blue one, this is very much the kind of thing that the Labour Party were, I believe, all about when they were in power, which is community cohesion and responsible citizens. The more conservative version, going back to that debate in Parliament in 2009, is the one at the top, the one in pink. Proud to be British and of the country's past and so on. But what's interesting is how this panned out in terms of distribution among our students. So there was a sample of 40. 31 cases referenced understanding of the past positively as an important aim. The right hand of the diagram shows you the things that figured a lot in what they said. Interestingly, the aesthetic thing was pretty big, 24 instances of reference to learning about the past as an aesthetic thing. Jorn Roosen would be pleased, 22 kind of historical consciousness codings. Some, the past for its own sake. We must know and understand the past because it's the past and we must know it. And, some of them going on about skills. What you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram is what they didn't like, what they actually mentioned negatively, which is national identity, promoting that, subordinating history to citizenship was negatively described as well. And that's quite interesting, I think. So far, what I've tried to do, to recap, is try and give you some sense of what we mean by school history. What do curriculum documents say? What do politicians say? What do teachers think? I mean, I appreciate, of course, looking at 40 student teachers is not exactly a massive window into teachers, but it gives you some indication of differences in aims among different groups. And as I said, the curriculum itself is heteroglossic. It's a kind of combination of voices, and even more so than when it comes to practice, because teachers respond to their kids, they have to adapt curriculum to their context and so on. Right, so I'm going to basically just articulate where I'm coming from on this, and then talk about some of the challenges I think that the approach I've tended to take faces, and then we're going to get nearer to the things we all want to hear about, the intersection with theory of history, I'm hoping. So I have always been an advocate of what I would call a disciplinary model of history. And these are, if you like, the kind of coordinates that inspire me, and the sort of books that I don't keep by my bed quite, but these are the books I read again and again and again. So on the left-hand side, we have two people theorizing and writing about history and heritage, or the difference between history and collective memory. And a lot of my thinking about what history education should be has agreed with that. And that's one of the things actually that I think we now have to open up for question, this idea that one can draw sharp lines. And Jim Virch draws very sharp lines. He has a diagram in which the things are polarized. So this notion then that when we do school history, we're not doing collective memory, we're not looking at heritage, we're looking at something else. And what is that something else? I'm really interested in Leon Goldstein, because before I read his work and before I read Alan McGill's work, I was quite persuaded by postmodernist positions on relativist positions on language and knowledge. But I think actually you can perfectly well advocate for history without committing yourself to naive realism. And Goldstein, as I'm sure many of you know, is a constructivist. He thinks that what we do in history is explain the evidence. He says, I don't care that the past is gone. I don't care that I can't go and visit it. It doesn't bother me in the least. What I can do is robustly and rigorously argue with you about the most cogent and valid and reliably based interpretations of the evidence. And we can have a rational, if you like, in Collingwood's terms, scientific discussion about all of that, because history is an interpersonal process of interpretation and reasoning, following rules of evidence, democratic protocols such as listening to each other and so on, which is really the kind of thing that Alan McGill argues. Collingwood, I'm not an idealist necessarily, but I'm certainly not a naive realist. And the thing I really take from Collingwood is the power of the question, that history varies with the questions that you ask. And it's never a naive realist transcription of the truth. It's always an interrogation which leads to creative outcomes, because the question and the methodology yield different results. And Carlo Ginzburg's there just because he's a brilliant example of a creative historian who comes up with interpretations that astonish me almost every time. So this is a vision, if you like, of history as a discipline, distinct from historical memory or collective memory, and as a discipline that has rigor and procedures, but also creativity, and that isn't naive realist, and that can hold its own against some forms of relativism. Because in the end, Goldstein would argue, McGill would argue, Collingwood would argue, and I agree with them, and so would Ginsberg, there are tenable and untenable readings of the evidence, and we can decide that in public forums through argument. So here is a schema of that, and I recognise this is problematic. But 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have recognised that. So, big up the history. This is what we should be getting children to do in schools. Understand how to engage critically with the past, making arguments that are probative, focused on proof. It's a matter of cognition first and foremost. It's a matter of epistemology and knowledges, and it has interpersonal rationality. You can debate the validity of what historians say. That's the kind of vision of history that I think I would call disciplinary. And you counterpose it to all these other things, to affirmative, affective, identity constructing, solidarity building, stories. Because the argument goes, the stuff on the left does not have epistemic value. It doesn't have the qualities of robustness that the stuff on the right has. Okay, just to keep going with this, here is the kind of thing I told my students when I was still a teacher history was all about. I wrote a course guide for them in 2002. This is for my pre-university 16, 17, 18-year-old students. You can see a very clear disciplinary construction of knowledge. History is all about the interpretation of evidence, the construction of arguments. It's all about knowledge and so on. Now, and I still believe all of this. I've just published this book, and my colleague Alison, who's here, contributed to it. Thank you very much again for that, Alison. This book is an engagement with the sociologist of the curriculum, Michael Young, who's one of my colleagues and also, I would say, a friend. And we all agree that knowledge matters and that knowing matters, and that education should be about developing disciplinary knowledge of the past, because it is rational, because it is empowering. If you understand how the world works, you can live in it more effectively, these kinds of things. And if you look in that book, you'll find a very cognitive construction of history. It's all about knowledge, it's all about concepts, about procedures, building knowledge. You'll also find an analysis of knowledge that distinguishes between the past itself, which is the first order things on the left, and the apparatus of interpretation, which is the stuff on the right. This is a vision that says we want children to build knowledge of the past, the stuff on the left. We want them also to build understanding of how the discipline works and of the tools they will need to interpret and argue about the past. And you can see things which I hope are familiar there, that some of it is, I guess, educationalist jargon, in which case I apologise, but I think most of us will recognise colligation from Whewell and Walsh and so on. And I know that Kukanen discusses it, of course, in his 2016 book. And, we know from reading Frank Ankersmith, don't we, the debate about singular factual propositions versus their construction in narratives, also, I guess, in Hayden White as well. So I guess there's quite a lot here that'd be familiar. But this, I think, is what we mean by a disciplinary approach to history in schools, at least. It's commonly found in Canada. You'll find something like this in parts of the US, influenced by Sam Weinberg. You'll certainly find a lot of it in England. You could see it in our curriculum. Also, as well, just to say, this is where my expertise, such as insofar as I have any, is my research, my PhD, my key interest is in children and their preconceptions. And the book and my approach to knowledge assumes that children come to history and come to our lessons with already in their minds substantive knowledge about the world. Number one, ideas about the world on the left. They also come to our classes with ideas about what history is and how we know things based on common sense. And in history education, we're in the business, I would say, and I think it's probably right, in trying to change and challenge and develop those two dimensions of children's thinking. Often they have misconceptions, actually, which make that difficult for us. But nevertheless, that's what we have to do. We try and build their world knowledge by changing their minds, challenging misconceptions, building more powerful structures, temporal structures, conceptual models of the economy or whatever. We also try and develop their epistemologies and their understanding of how you make knowledge. And history education is a good thing on this model because we want to understand the world if we're going to act in it rationally, and history is a really good way of developing all of that. Just to say as well, and this is something I advocate in the book, that's not my idea, what about developing that world knowledge? And I do make reference to this in the book, though it's not my model. But this is a proposal that says we start in the middle of the circle by teaching children about episodes. You know, we would study, let's say, the Black Death. And we would study it politically, we would study it culturally, we'd study it socially and economically. Those are the divisions in the circle. But we'd work out from the episodes of the Black Death, let's say an outbreak in one village, we'd work out from that to an understanding of the medieval period, which is the second circle. And as we studied new periods and new topics going through the time in school, we would be aiming to build the outer circle, which is, if you like, general understandings of how politics works in human societies, general understandings of how ideas and cultures work in human societies, general understandings of how economies work and so on. And we would say that the positive benefit of this for children is they can then apply that knowledge, not directly, because the past and the present are different, and hopefully they'll have come to understand that because we'd have taught them about lots of different things in the past. So they won't be simple-minded and presentist, but hopefully they'll have if what Droysen would call a kind of wisdom, an understanding of, you know, how things are, and history can help build that, as well as fascination by the episodes that they'd studied and a good sense of period and so on. Great, so that's, if you like, conventional disciplinary history, which I've been an advocate of for too long. And I still am a strong advocate of that. In the last 20 years, so since 10 years into my career, I came across this. I've found one really interesting thing coming from the discourse of historical theory, which has influenced my thinking and also the thinking of many others as well, which are the sorts of ideas you'll find in Jorn Rüsen, but also Jürgen Straub and other people as well, of course. And these ideas, this is my attempt to summarize them, but one aspect of them is this model of forms of historical consciousness that I know we'll all be familiar with. And this fits really nicely with the disciplinary framework, because there's an arrow, isn't there, in Rüsen's thinking. 1 leads to 2, leads to 3, leads to 4, and 4 is more sophisticated than 1. So really, this is basically saying that what we should be doing through our teaching is trying to build historical culture informed by historicist ideas, to genetical approach. Historicists want to say, don't they, as Ranke put it, that every epoch is as near to God as the rest. You know, all of us have our own, epochs of history have their own ways of doing things. We need to understand that. We shouldn't judge the past simplistically. You know, we should be aware of time and change and so on. And Rüsen's ideas, I think, have been quite influential, certainly in history education internationally, to some extent in England. And this is the kind of thing I think that Rüsen would advocate. You know, we can think about continuity and discontinuity. We can think about affirmation and negation when we talk about the past. We could start by thinking that what we should do in our relationship to the past should be governed by a traditional orientation in which we simply continue the great stuff that our ancestors did. That, if you like, is what those politicians were advocating, what Maryland was advocating. You might want to actually tear up and start again, which is what a lot of people do, and I would call this a critical approach to the past. You might want to say that what we should do is recognize the past and the difference between the present and the past and be quite relaxed about time and change because it's inevitable, which is, I think, Rüsen's his genetical approach, or something which is kind of a mixture between the critical and something else. This notion, I suppose, that there is time and change and that the present is better than the past. These are the kinds of ideas you could play around with, I think, inspired by Rüsen. And I think they're very consistent with a disciplinary approach and don't pose any problems for it, really. And as I say, it's been influential in various ways. This is a 2004 book edited by Peter Seixas in British Columbia, with contributions from Rüsen and from various other colleagues internationally. Okay, let's get on to how I think contemporary history and historical theory challenges what we're doing, and I'll try and speed up because I know I'm taking a while. One thing I think is interesting is the work of Sam Weinberg. So Sam Weinberg is somebody who is closely associated with disciplinary models of history, with the notion that history is an empowering way of thinking about the world and that it's really good if kids come to think like historians. But he's done a couple of studies, actually, which seem to shake up and raise questions about some of these ideas. This is one of them with Ellie Gottlieb from 2012. It's called Between Veritas and Communitas, Epistemic Switching. And what it is, if you look at the two pictures at the top, it's a study with two groups of people in America and in Israel, some of whom were historians, some of whom were more religious in orientation, some of whom were both in Israel, and in America, some of whom were historians, some of whom were, if you like, just ordinary patriotic Americans, and some of whom were both. And the diagram you can see at the bottom shows how the historians shifted as they read documents about Thanksgiving, some of which were the kinds of things you'd find in children's books, if you like, national religion, some of which were the kinds of things you'd find historians arguing, authentic documents. Or in the case of Israel, stories about Moses, some of which were Bible stories, some of which were archaeological, historical ones. But what the graph shows you is how historians often shifted their thinking depending on the closer they got to their personal identifications with the stories. If you like, their identifications of a patriotic kind or their identifications of a religious kind. And Weinberg says what this shows us is that robustly educated PhD holding historians shift epistemologies when their identities and the magnetic draw of their identities cause them to, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Given that a lot of people who advocate disciplinary history spend their time saying history teaches you to be rational, history allows you to take a distance from national myth. Well, isn't it interesting to see what historians do when national myth starts to exercise its pull? Second thing that Weinberg's done more recently, this is studies on fake news and spotting false websites. And if you look at the abstract, it really does shake up the things historians like to tell themselves and that people like me have been saying about the value of studying history. Because if you see, it says 10 PhD historians, 10 professional fact checkers, and 25 Stanford University undergraduates were asked to basically evaluate websites. And as it says, historians and students often fell victim to easily manipulated features of websites, official looking logos, domain names, and so on. So what this actually seems to suggest is that in and of itself, being a highly qualified PhD'd up historian who knows all about evidence doesn't really help you spot fake news. So challenge number one then to the disciplinary rationale for history is that historians are just like other people, as prone to ideological identifications as other people. That's the thing that Weinberg shows. Also, historians are not necessarily more rational and more critical in their thinking. This is a study I did a long time ago now, but of my own students, and this gave me real pause for thought as well. I was just teaching them history. I wasn't trying to teach them anything about the present. I wasn't trying to get them to think ideologically or politically or even to engage with the present. And then when I asked them at the end of their course what they'd learned, here are some of the kinds of things they were writing. Iraq, I was scared. There seemed to be parallels and huge similarities between history and the present day. I was irritated that the government seemed to be making the same mistakes over and over again. What we've got, I think, is what I would have called at the time and probably would still call a facile analogy. I don't really think you can make the comparisons they're making. Or we've got people saying that the current treatment by America and the West of the Muslim world is basically fascist, just like Nazis. And what that tells me is that our students, even if we think we're teaching them disciplinary history, are also reading history in all kinds of other ways. So challenge number one then to the disciplinary model is it can account for some things. It can account for the rationality of historians when faced with historical documents. But we can see also that historians and school kids do much more than that and are governed by much more than that. So simply thinking in those terms is insufficient. Next challenge. We all know, don't we, about the histories that we've seen since 2016. They were there anyway, but they've really come through. This is the harbour in Bristol. This is the slave trader Colston, his statue erected in Bristol in 1895, going into the water where slave ships would have docked, within sight of Edmund Pettus Bridge. Not Edmund, sorry. That's what have I just said? I'm confusing. This bridge, which is celebrating, commemorating a slave, with the bridge at Selma. I'm sorry about that. But the bridge in the background is a symbol of Bristol trying to come to terms with its slave trading past. It's got nothing to do with the Confederacy. I don't know how I did that. And of course, here we have Charlottesville. So, what this tells us, I think, is about the importance of values and the politically explosive nature of political narratives and public representations of the past. What is there in the history curriculum that allows children to think critically about this? That's my question. And the thing is that when we thought about these things in history education, we thought about them in a Rusin-inspired way. So this is a really interesting article by Peter Seychelles and Penny Clark from 2007, I think it is. No, it's 2004, sorry. It's about the murals in the British Columbia legislature, which this here is a blog critiquing them from a First Nations perspective. And the controversy about the murals was because they depicted First Nations in subservient ways, also in sexualized ways, mostly naked and things like that, distorting the history, representing people signing treaties when they were actually in prison or had been hung and things like this. And what Seychelles did was he studied what school children thought should be done. What should we do with these murals? And using a Rusin-inspired framework, I think it was actually Nietzsche, not Rusin, but the outcome was the same. They were saying the more sophisticated children, the ones who realized that what we should do is not tear down, not remove these murals. We should historicize them and understand the difference between the past and the present and all of that. Now, what gave me real pause for thought in the summer and subsequently, and going back to 2017, sorry, and in the summer and subsequently, was the way arguments just like this, which I myself would have used, I was very inspired by this paper, are politically weaponized. So here are some British newspapers. On the left, we've got the government's proposal. What should you do with statues? They are legislating, so they cannot be taken down so easily, and requiring that we retain and explain them. In other words, it's and this aligns perfectly with what Rusin might advocate maybe, and what a lot of historians would say is perfectly rational, which is to recognize the difference between the past and the present, say that was a different time, reinterpret the monument, but do not destroy the history, that kind of thing. But our government is arguing this, and it's arguing it, I think you can say, without me being too tendentious, as part of an attempt to engage in the culture war. So the rational historical perspective, as I would have put it, is being weaponized against quote unquote woke militants, people who want to take down statues. The rational thing to do is retain and explain and stop being woke, is what is being said. And that gives me some pause for thought. Okay, let's get on with, let's move to historical theory. Now, obviously, I can't be comprehensive, and there are many more things to say than I'm going to manage here. And obviously, this is, as I should have said, actually, this whole presentation is one perspective. It's from England. I'm only one person. There are other English people here who will take different positions, I know. But furthermore, this is just the reading of the things that really strike me as interesting in contemporary historical theory. I appreciate there are other things to say. Okay, so I'm really impressed by this article, which I read some years ago now, by Berber Bevernage, which is about, as he says, how he wants the philosophy of history to shift into a philosophy of historicities. Obviously, we need to explain what that means. But I think school history needs to do the same. It needs to move from being focused on historical knowing to a focus on historical knowing alongside other forms of knowing. And that would allow children to begin to understand things like Charlottesville, or at least have something intelligent to say about it, to have some way of commenting on what the government are doing when they deploy historical rationality for political aims. Here are the things Bevernage says. So that the first of these is we've been too cognitivist. So the function of historiography thought of in epistemological and cognitive terms. Of course, that's important. Of course, historiography is all the things that Rusin and Goldstein and others say it is. But as Bevernage says, if we just focus on that, what do we miss? We miss the plurality of social, political, and cultural functions of historiography. The same with history in schools, it seems to me. And what we tend to do is really suggest all those things are just bad history, So you do get history teachers in England, though a lot of people would pour scorn on this, but you do get people critically evaluating popular cultural representations of the past, which were never intended to be accurate, which is actually nonsense, isn't it? It's like saying this orange is not an apple. How terrible. We shouldn't regard then historical culture as if it was historiography. We shouldn't simply teach children to think about the past as if all the ways we engage with it are historical in the narrow disciplinary sense, which I've been advocating. The next thing Bevernage says, which I think is right, is not engaging with moral, religious, commemorative, legal, engaged present-focused activism. And, you know, what do people do? And what do those statues show? And what does Charlottesville show? And what does our government show? And what do those debates with politicians about what curriculum should be also show? They show that the past is a weaponized part of the present, isn't it? And not just weaponized, of course, it's a community building resource, it's all kinds of things. And if we simply treat it as cognitive, we miss all of that. Finally, of course, talking about the past, even when it looks like it's merely representational, is a form of action. We know this, don't we, from Austin's studies of language use. We know it, the performative approach to the past. Let me come on to that, so I'm mindful I need to stop in about 8 minutes probably. Okay, so developing some of Bevenage's things. The emphasis in work by Jay Winter, in work by Bevenage, in work by Bevenage and Lorenz on the performativity of history is really, really important. And I think we should bring this into our studies of the past. What are people doing when they talk about the past? They're not just talking about the past. They are enacting things in the present. And Bevenage's book, which I commend to you if you don't know it, has this amazingly powerful argument, I think, about pasting. When you say something is over, what are you saying? Here's an example of a performative use of the past from today's papers in England. The government demanding, this is the same government, by the way, that want to retain and explain monuments. They insist that this flag, this symbol of our history, be flown over all government buildings as a way of affirming a certain orientation to the world. This is a performative use of a symbol of the past if ever there was one. But historians do it too. One of my favorite history books, one of the first things I remember reading when I started my BA, François Furet's book in the French Revolution. And the chapter that really annoyed me actually was the one, The French Revolution is Over. Furet was in the business of making performative statements, as we know if we look at his engagement with the historians dispute in Germany and his engagement with the history of the Cold War and with the argument that the communists and the fascists are the same thing in the end. So here we have an example of the past as the history as performance as well, that's much more academic. And of course, many people's reaction, as mine was in the late 80s, was, no, it isn't. The French Revolution continues. So I think then what I'm saying is we need to get kids to realize the uses of the past, the meaning of pasting, what it means to treat something as if it was over, which is what you do in history. And you can see that in debates over these statues. Some people say it's the past, retain and explain, don't be a barbarian. Other people say it is not the past. The ongoing narrative of racism and exploitation is with us now. We must take it down. So the performativity of labeling things historical is one example of some of the things we should be talking about. I'm very impressed also by the notion of relations to the past, which I think Herman Poole gets from a paper which is described in this book by Mark Day. So the notion here then is that we should anthropologize how we think about time and change and history, and recognize that people have many different ways of relating to the past. We live in the past in old houses. We live in the past materially through our own bodies. We have aesthetic relationships to the past and to time and to objects that are old. We use them for political projects, community building, community destroying, challenging narratives, building up narratives, all kinds of things to stake a claim to a place. And human beings have always done this. We do ask questions about it and we do analyze it. We also use it to make claims about responsibility and blame. How many of these things does history education prepare children to understand is my question. And the answer is, I'm afraid, not as many of them as we would want, and we're mostly focused on the epistemic. An example of the kinds of things we need children to understand. This is a brilliant book by a brilliant public historian, David Olusoga, and it is a paradigmatically superb example of disciplinary history. It is also, however, a campaigning moral statement. It is arguing that a history has been hidden. It reminds me of E.P. Thompson in his Making of the English Working Class. He said, what we must do is rescue those who've been crushed under the wheels of history from, quote, the immense condescension of posterity. Both Olusoga and Thompson do superb, argued, researched disciplinary history, but they are also on a mission, a moral mission. And the two things converge. They are both saying we need accuracy, we need historical sensitivity, we need to bring the full truth out, all those sorts of things. But Olusoga also made a brilliant series of documentaries based on his book. And in those documentaries, the nature of the project is also, deeply disciplinary, deeply epistemic. But we also see not only the desire to put right injustice, a commemorative moral engagement with the dead. 20 plaques are put up in sites of unacknowledged history that are now being brought to light. Bunce Island in Sierra Leone is the first one. And the second one is a Roman fort in Cumbria, where there were auxiliaries who were African. So that's an example, I think, of the multiple relations to the past that we should be engaging with in school history. And if we think it isn't our business, well, kids are going to be coming across this in everyday culture anyway, and we need to help them. Finally, and I'm going to make reference to Zoltan's work in a minute, what else strikes me about contemporary historical theory that doesn't really align with, if you like, the modernism of a lot of history education? It's this notion of apprehension, essentially of panic. I was very worried reading this book by Martin Davies 10 years ago. I was annoyed with it, actually, because I was looking for a manual on history that would do Droysen for me now and I could use. But it's really an extended critique of historical culture. And he's saying that one of the arguments is that contemporary historical culture hides from us the full horror of the anxiety-inducing features of our world. And he wants to broaden out history so that it isn't just about comprehension, it's about apprehension, about a wider range of things. And of course, the contemporary work on the Anthropocene. Zoltan and other scholars inspire us to engage with that further. And I think it was, I've forgotten who, one of the articles in the most recent, the December edition of the Journal of Philosophy of History included this logo, which I found very, very striking indeed. And it's an image of the great acceleration. I don't know if people have seen the graphs, just how much all the indicators of population, but resource consumption, pollution, all of these things shift at a totally unprecedented, to use a word that Zoltan uses a lot, rate from after the Second World War, taking us to the position we're in now, where we have, unprecedented, in a way incomprehensible, because we have no yardstick or no way of grasping them, and alarming trends. We've had the Amazon, we've had the Australia on fire, we've had COVID, we all know the stories, don't we? What is there in their history education that prepares kids for thinking about any of that? Okay, really quickly, and I really will stop, I promise. Okay, propositions then, what can we do? I think the disciplinary approach to history is an excellent thing and we must keep doing it. It is not enough, it is necessary but not sufficient. We need a focus on beyond analytical history to enable a fuller understanding of the public forms of engagement with the past. How is the past used? How is the past present? Not simply in historical form, in many others, as Herman Paul tells us, as Bavanage tells us, and so on. Not only that, we need school history to actually enable children to make sense of the world that they're in. Now, much as you could use the Black Death to help you think about coronavirus, you can't really use the Middle Ages to help you think about the end of the Holocene, which is what we face now as a result of the Great Acceleration, of course, isn't it, and the Anthropocene. So we need a history that tries to do that. We have resources we can draw upon. In our curriculum, going back to the document I showed you earlier, there is an emphasis on interpretation, on plural representation. However, it is quite narrow. It's historiographic mostly. It used to be more. This is the old curriculum from 2007. Here we can see understanding how historians and others form interpretations, how they present the past, how they engage with the past. So I think, we could develop this approach to representation of the past in many forms beyond the historiographic in ways that would really help children understand and prepare them for the sort of historical culture that they're in. Also, as well, I'm very struck by the work that's taken David Christian's superb mega studies of the history of the universe and rolled that out for children. So this is the big history project. I know people will be aware of it, I'm sure, but the Gates Foundation basically funded Christian to try and take this work forward. And maybe there's hope there. That's what I wanted to say. So in a nutshell, I hope I've given you some idea of the sorts of things school history is. and albeit in a partial and slight way, because I know historical theory is a massive thing and I've only begun to scratch the surface in some areas, but some of the ways I think we can learn from what people do at your centre and elsewhere in the historical theory field. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much for your talk. That was very rich and a lot of connections to obviously philosophy of history and theory of history. And we already have one question by David Chernin. So please, David, take the mic.
Thank you, Georg, and thank you, Arthur. It was excellent talk. I really love it. I would like to mention that I'm coming from a team of philosophers, historians, and didactics in Czech Republic, and we are currently pursuing very similar project to improve curriculum of history in Czech Republic. Czech Republic is generally lagging behind the rest of Western world, I would say, but we are dealing with pretty much very similar problems in the end with the curriculum. Currently, our curriculum is lacking any content. We are only focusing on competencies and some epistemic goals, let's say. When I saw that you are coming from Leon J. Goldstein or Collingwood, I really knew that this is excellent, or not excellent, but this is really my kind of approach to the situation. But in the end, I would like to try to rephrase your message. So in the end, you would say that history education should be some kind of self-defense course for young people in order how to defend themselves against weaponized use of history, as you call it yourself, that it should be sort of a self-defense course, or the students coming from your history classes should be better than those historians you mentioned that failed at actually deciphering fake news or conspiracy theories on the internet. Because that's something I could really get behind. I would say I really believe that history has deep untapped potential for teaching critical thinking and source criticism, etc. So, thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, I would say that I think it has got a role in protecting people against weaponization of things, but much more than that, I'd want to give it a positive role as well. So, you know, we all are historical beings, aren't we? We live in time, we have historicity. So thinking about all these different things, like, you know, how we identify with the past, how we don't, how we want to reject aspects of the past, talking about, you know, change and these sorts of issues. But also, you know, discussing the morality of the current situations and the legacies of past problems as well. These are all positive things as well. So I think definitely it can help you. I think if you understand history better, I'm hoping you would, you know, want to question the notion, let's say, that statues are the past, or rather statues are history, which people often say. Of course they're not. So, you know, there would be a kind of historical literacy coming out of studying the past, which would hopefully be a defense against weaponization. I think the depressing thing, mind you, about Weinberg's work is it does suggest that we cannot rely on historical criticality alone. And that also draws attention to one of the important things, I think, from history education, which is why content is important, which is, you know, you need expertise in particular things. And the conclusion that Weinberg draws is that actually fake news works in ways which is not like written documents. And actually it fools historians, because fake news tries to look like authentic documents. Historians look for signs of documentary authenticity and are fooled. But so the history is not enough. We also need to know about, you know, other things in the present that historical models don't necessarily give you understanding of. But yeah, I think a prophylactic, a defense, but also a way of just celebrating the richness of our lives, which we live in time and which we can think about in many ways, in aesthetic ways, personal ways, deeply saddening ways, uplifting ways, critical ways, all of these things. And I think the history education is basically a bit too rationalistic. I don't mean to say I don't like reasoning. We need it. We need some other things as well.
All right. There's another question by Jan Löfström.
Hi, Jan.
Hi. Thank you, Arthur, very much for this exciting talk. And I think I probably don't have anything any disagreements with you. But my question, which is a kind of double-barreled question, is about the implications of what you are suggesting, I think, and what I would warmly support. And I myself, as a history educator, I think of the implications at the level of curriculum and all that. And now, am I right? I mean, this double-barrel question. That am I right to begin with that that many of those things that you would like to see take place in the history classroom, thinking about the meaning of the past to young people, to the kids, and what the kind of relation they have with the past and their identities and all the moral questions, obviously, and so on, that they often are, I guess, in the national curriculum, history curriculum, somewhere in the general part, saying something about the like general aims of history education, but what where they should rather be is actually in the part of the syllabus where actually the teachers and the textbook authors take their guidance from, because that's sort of like the practical thing. You actually showed also some slides where there were these like dots that now we'll be talking about the church and Reformation in Britain and so on. I suppose, if I'm right, that actually these questions about moral meanings and other things, that they should actually be in the curriculum also in that part of the text, which is about what shall we do in grade 8 in the spring term or something like that. But then the second question, the other barrel of my question, is that what are the problems that you can see here? Because there are so many like demands and question expectations that also the achievements, the results, learning must be assessed. It must be assessed, and of course it can be assessed how well the kids can interpret historical documents and how much like historical facts they know. But then I suppose it might be a bit difficult to assess how they deal with these like different kinds of meanings of the past to themselves and so on. And anyway, the government and the authorities and whatever, they expect teachers to assess students' historical whatever it is. So that is there a kind of like what's the English word now, like a sinister force coming from outside the classroom that makes teachers forces teachers to concentrate on the kind of questions that probably they themselves and pupils would like to discuss in the classroom, but someone expects that there needs to be assessment. Sorry, a long question.
I agree, and I think the two things you've mentioned do converge. You know, the double barrels converge into one, maybe, because if it isn't in the curriculum, you know, if it isn't worked through in detail, no one will do it. But also it's the case, I think, certainly in England and in many jurisdictions I know, that in a way, if it's on the curriculum, people will ignore it unless it's in the assessment, because schools are judged by assessment outcomes. So in a way, the most important thing is the assessment framework. So my thinking then is we need to get these things in the assessment framework. Now that's not easy because, you know, we don't know how to do some of them. You know, we're much better at, as you say, thinking about historical evidence or assessing factual knowledge than we are at assessing historical consciousness. And even though people have been trying to assess historical consciousness, people have tried to put reason to work. I know Peter Lee did that. I know that you and your work have done thinking about, you know, how we can do assessment of kids thinking about moral relations to the past. So we don't know how to do all of these things, but that's no reason why we shouldn't work it out. You know, there must be ways of thinking through what a more and a less sophisticated understanding, let's say, of uses of the past would be. So I think what we need to do then is work at this from the assessment end and put in assessments that target things broader than knowledge and evidential reasoning and causal reasoning, and that, you know, target kids' understandings of history at scale. Let's say the Anthropocene requires, you know, the large scale. We need to be talking about epochal understandings, but also things like moral relations to the past. You know, we need to think of ways of assessing them. And I mean, also one of the benefits of this rather pointless study I mentioned, this study where we compared all these different curriculum documents, it was pointless, by the way, because you can't find out, you know, why America is lower down in PISA than Shanghai by looking at the curriculum. You've got to ask about the classroom. But one of the good things about doing that kind of work is it shows you systems where assessment is different, you know, systems where more teacher assessment is possible. And I think some of these things would require a lot of teacher assessment rather than examination. If you want, for example, children to do something in their community about commemoration, that's going to require the kind of thing you can't really do in an exam hall. So it's going to require teacher assessment. So I agree with all the concerns you've raised, and the solution maybe is to think about how to assess these things. And that might require a lot of theorizing, but also practical rearrangements as well, because certain kinds of things cannot really be assessed in an examination.
Thanks. So let's get on with it.
All right, thank you. There was another question by Andreas Körber.
Andreas, hi.
Hi, Arthur. I was a bit late. Sorry, I had my Sprechstunde, my office hours a bit delayed. But I found it very intriguing. And as Jan said, I don't think I have many things where I would contradict, maybe a bit of differentiation. But I want to hook up a bit into what you just answered to Jan. I'm a bit worried, specifically because I'm very late in writing an article on assessment, grading, examination, which should have been ready weeks ago and still isn't really drafted, because I'm always wondering whether we should confound with examination of students, of their Leistung, their achievement, their performances, and assessments of teaching of systems. So is it, should we really measure the schools and the teaching by what individual students can get? Because I think that those are different levels. And in Germany, we don't have a big assessment system for schools. We have inspections still, and I think we face the same problems. And I think what we need to do is we have to find ways in which we not so much assess the teaching in itself or the schools, but in which we ways of introducing these aspects of addressing history, culture in the broad sense, as you laid out, into the examines for students, so that the teachers are not focused on we only do things which we have to test the students afterwards. If we have central assessment, so I would, or central examinations, I would strongly advocate, which I've done 20 years ago and come back to it now, that we get, in a way, we may have central assessments and comparative assessments quantitatively in a large scale, but student examination should be rather near or close to the teaching process, so that we really can engage with how students think. And the reason for that is that I think there is a great danger in formalizing these insights into how history culture works, how pasting is done, if we do it on large scale forms. I myself, we have created large scale assessments, but not for individual assessments, but for getting an idea of what methods work, what kind of resources work. But for individual examinations, I think we should be very close to the students and get rather qualitative in their engaging how they are doing, what they are thinking, and their different perspectives. Because standardization would eradicate their individual perspectives, their own questions, and their agency in engaging with it. And that, I think, is the real problem. We can assess systems and institutions, but as soon as we go to the students, we should not forget that, as you said, it's about their agency to not function, but engage in these societies, that we must give them opportunities to bring in their own perspectives, which then leads to different results, to tasks, and all these things. And so maybe that's something where history, maybe it's the same with religion and other cultural subjects, but history specifically should not go along with more standardized testing, but go back into enabling students, encouraging them even to different or to differ between each other.
I defer to your expertise on assessments. I know that you thought about it a lot, and I wouldn't pretend that I have. I mean, my expertise, again, such as I have it, is in trying to understand children's thinking about particular historical concepts. But yeah, I think while you were talking, I think you're right. Wouldn't it be better if many things could be assessed as you could stipulate in the curriculum schools should do certain sorts of things. You could have teacher assessment of individual pupils to see whether they've done those things, and that would allow a great variety of approaches. It would allow children to do community projects. It would allow all kinds of things beyond the conventional examination. And if you then put the emphasis on assessing whether the school curriculum is actually providing children with opportunities, that could be a much more effective way of doing these things authentically. But I mean, I'm struck again and again, it is one of the benefits, I think, of doing comparative work by the importance of teacher assessment. I think that in England, we tend to be very suspicious of it. I think we should learn from countries where there's more of it. Because, as you say, if you want to really understand what children are doing, it helps if you know them. It helps if you can assess them in creative ways. And I would like to see more of that. So maybe it's the curriculum then, like Jan suggested, where you say we must have these things in the school curriculum. Maybe that's assessed by inspection, and individual level children's thinking is assessed more by their teachers. Maybe that's the way, I don't know.
All right, thank you. The next question is Yoni-Matti Kukan.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Arthur. I think I have a kind of a meta level question dealing with the nature of history, philosophy of history, and theory of history. And I'd like to begin from quite in the end when you said we need something more and we need to go beyond analytical philosophy of history. And there I was wondering simply who are we and what is it that we need it for? So, and that takes me to another way you said earlier, and you referred to Berber's book, that there is we don't need so much philosophy of science, but what was it, historicities, and that I think I'm not sure I see the issue here, because it seems that there is a family of problems. So we can talk about popular history, we can talk about history as a knowledge producing activity, we can talk about the use of history, politics of history, and they may be overlapping, but it's really coming to also the question, is there one field that would cover it all? And if I think about philosophy of science, because my conception of let's say theoretical discussion about history is there really isn't anything corresponding to philosophy of science in philosophy of history. It's certainly as a disciplinary form of knowledge production, it is a topic for philosophy of science consideration, but there isn't such a thing. Analytical philosophy of history is gone, although there are some people who are trying to revive it, Paul Roth, for example, but it's not really going strong. And the link to sort of philosophical discussion in general is fairly weak. It's stronger regarding historiographical issues and stuff. And if I a bit continue, think about what philosophy of science does these days. Okay, it tries to understand scientific reasoning and models in science, representation in science, justification in science, but also values in science and such issues. And now I guess I'm coming to the point, because I see there would be a lot of to draw on, let's say, philosophical discussion, let's say inferential structures of reasoning, which could be used both in disciplinary form and in other forms. rules that determine correct or acceptable form of beliefs about history, or incorrect, and so on. There will be a lot of discussion. I do wonder what is we and what's field? Is there, can this one field actually even cover all these questions, or what are you really calling for? Because let's say if in philosophy of science, if one is interested in nature of scientific theorizing, of course someone else might be interested in politics of science, how science is used in political speeches in a similar way as someone is interested in politics of history. But still, there is a proper question: what is historical knowledge, and so on. So I guess this is an open invitation to explore further on what is it that we need.
Yes, so I mean, who are we? Very good question. So I suppose what I'm doing there is the thing that a lot of history education people do, which is just assume that we're one group. But of course, like anything else, there are divisions and disagreements and so on. But as you say as well, I mean, what are the resources available? So I take your point that you know, there'll be better developed resources in terms of cognitive tools and things in philosophy for certain aspects of these things than for others. And I suppose what the we then is history education, and what is it? It's going to have to be some sort of interdisciplinary field, isn't it, rather than simply grounded in epistemology of history or something. I mean, some of these issues are really anthropological, it seems to me, rather than historical in the conventional sense. You're asking about how societies manage time, you know, and you could write histories about that, but I think by and large that's the kind of question anthropologists are more used to answering than historians, and good historians who've talked about time that I can think of. Let's go back to E.B. Thompson and his paper on work discipline, or let's go to let's just stick with Thompson. I mean, what he did there was just draw anthropology as well, isn't it? So I guess the we is history educators, and what I'm really saying is the history educators have to be, like a lot of social and cultural historians, quite eclectic and draw upon a range of different things. In a way that's a weakness, but also in a way it's a strength, because historians are, I think, quite eclectic. You know, if you get a group of them together, one of them is probably more like an economist, one of them is more like a philosopher, one of them is really an anthropologist. You know, what is it that unites them? It isn't necessarily a methodology or even a theoretical framework. It's a concern with understanding the past. So yes, I think you're right. And in a way that just highlights the difficulty of what I'm proposing, I suppose, because you can't draw well on some philosophy, some epistemology, some anthropology without being very well trained. And I know that in a lot of contexts, history teachers aren't, because certainly in England, we have brilliantly trained history teachers, but we also have people with geography degrees or religious education degrees who teach history, you know, half their week. So I don't know if that answers some of your questions.
yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, Andreas Körber would have another question, but I would also have a question. I'm not sure if the stipulation about prioritizing also applies to me as the moderator. So I'll ask Andreas first. Would you like to go first, or should I?
I would hook on at what Johnny Matti asked. So if yours is to the same point, I would let you. But
I also have something sort of to the same philosophical issues and points. So
okay, then go first.
Okay, then I'll go first, and then you can go again.
No problem.
I also have sort of a question around the issue that you said, the disciplinary approach to history that you also sort of are a part of is too rationalistic. But at the same time, you say something like that historians, just like all other reasoners, make flaws that you wouldn't expect of them by their education. So can I say it maybe with the philosopher hat from the other way around, that maybe it's not rationalistic enough, the sort of disciplinary education of becoming a historian, or of historiography and history? So maybe introducing some philosophy proper, that sounds like it's very self-serving now, some philosophy proper, and maybe some understanding about mob epistemology or cognitive bias, as behavioral economics has been doing the last 30 years, would be very useful in a sense. But then I guess I'm not aware of philosophy as a subject in itself in Britain or in other contexts, and to what extent they can overlap and to what extent they can work together. And another general question was about this, or a question related to this is that you said we will have to understand there are different ways of relating to the past and of pasting, and that some historians is engaged in this futile task of trying to show that popular history is not backed by the evidence, not proper historiography. And then again, from my, if you like, in your sense, too rationalistic point of view, why is that a futile task? I suppose my claim would be sort of the more rational the understanding of historiography of any forms of relating to the past, if I put it very starkly, is the better it is for a society. Of course, the background or the underpinning value assumption is it's good to have true beliefs about anything or about the past. And then with true beliefs, it's probable, whatever it is, the knowledge or whatever. So in that sense. Of course, then the question is beyond that in terms of values would be something like, do we understand well enough about what other popular forms of history are, what they are for, what is their purpose and what is their value? And only if we do that, we can ask sort of this meta question, is having true knowledge about something more important than whatever else these forms of relating to the past give us? Maybe a shared sense of community that a true version would not, maybe feeling homely, maybe aesthetic appreciation, whatever it is. But only if we understood sort of the meta purposes of these other ways of relating to past as compared to the meta purpose of having true knowledge, which I think is a very, very important. That's what all science strives for, having true knowledge and of probable knowledge. Then we could make this sort of decision maybe in a sort of societal debate upon whether we want that or not. But I'm a very big fan, in a sense, on the face of it, that historians debunk anything that seems too simplistic or merely wrong or serving whatever ideological or other purpose. So that would be the question.
Okay, so I think I've got two things to say in reply. And just to deal with the second one first, I mean, I think what I'm saying really is I mean, you can judge, Asterix or something using historical criteria. You could. And there would be value in doing that. But you would also miss the point though, because the point is not to provide a veridical and reliable representation of Caesar and the occupation of Gaul. That's not what it's for. So really what I would say, and I agree with you, we do need to understand all these different forms of engagement with the past or relationships to the past and grasp their purpose and their logic and how they work. And I think all I'm saying really there is, when I'm saying it's foolish for historians to judge Asterix as if it was a PhD thesis, is that judgment should always be purpose relative. We should be considering what something's trying to do. Now we could step outside that. So for example, I've recently been looking at Holocaust denial and distortion. And there was a really interesting example of a few years ago that was actually well-intentioned. Someone was drawing Auschwitz with the Simpsons family in it. And they were doing this with a never again, agenda. But it's just crass beyond belief to do this. So just judging them in terms of their own purposes is not adequate. It would be unfair to say, hang on a minute, and to treat that as if it was a monograph on the Holocaust. But it is also right to say that what you're doing is contributing to a culture of misrepresentation and possibly trivialization and also, aren't the Simpsons supposed to be funny? And there's something a bit unethical. So yes, I agree that I wouldn't go absolutely with my position there, but I think my point is really we should try and judge things primarily in terms of what they're trying to do. I don't know if that works for you, but I would agree also that we do need to understand what things are trying to do better than we do, and maybe to take them more seriously than we have tended to. That's my response on the second aspect of your question. On the first one, do we need more philosophy rather than less? And the historians making mistakes perhaps means they need to do more methodology or some more critical thinking or something. I'm in two minds about that. I am a great believer in critical thinking, and in education circles in the last 10 years, there's been quite a lot of dismissal of it by psychologists. They say that it's wrong to talk about, totally generic and transferable across all fields modes of critical analysis. And they what they're trying to say is that actually knowledge of the field, or knowledge of the type of thing you're looking at, is really important. Now, to some extent, I agree with them, and I think Weinberg shows that. The historians are really, really good at thinking critically about documents. And the mistake is when they treat online text as if it was a document. You know, these things are created in particular ways, and they just don't fit the pattern the historians are using. So in a way, I think that the people who say critical thinking is problematic, we have to be more specific, are right. However, I also think critical thinking is really important, and I taught it a lot when I was a teacher, and it really annoys me when people dismiss it, because really, to me, critical thinking is just applied logic. So, and of course it helps people to understand logic, you know, so in a way I agree with you. But I think part of the problem is that, you know, generic philosophizing or highly reflective and critical approaches to reasoning won't always help you, because you'll have learned that in the context of certain types of problem, certain types of text, and you will come across other types of problem and other types of text which you respond to because of a cognitive bias, I suppose, as if they were the ones you were used to, and that's actually the problem. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
No, thank you very much, Arthur. Okay, then it's Andreas Körber again. Then.
Yes, thank you. I think it's maybe more of a comment or part of a discussion than a real question about what Joni Mattis asked about the way and the role of philosophy. I think there is one it's a specific perspective we need to adopt as educators. It's not about the things we teach or we address, whether they are philosophically valid or it's not only about whether they are philosophically valid or up to date. But I think what this we, Arthur, correct me if I'm wrong, characterizes is that we all address these in a perspective of enabling students to increasingly engage with them in a specific, to successively, progressively grasp them. So not in a one-off version, now we have learned about this, what it's the meaning, but we have to take a perspective of enabling students to increasingly do it. And a second one, to do this in societies where students have very different experiences and backgrounds, not only different deficits in what they don't know, but what they bring in. You said they are not the tabula rasa when they come in, but they have all this memory, even factual knowledge or factual in apostrophes. So it's not about understanding the past, I think, but understanding each other's and each other's peer groups, each other's cultures, relations to the past in an increasing way. And so from that perspective, I think, and now relate to what Georg was asking, that even debunking is not unnecessary. It's very valid. But I don't think it's the result of debunking, which is interesting for this teaching perspective, but the criteria, the argumentations of making things plausible. So I can even use a distorted representation, like the boy in the striped pajama, for making students aware of what is it about, what it makes this so problematic, and not only what makes it problematic, why should I throw it away or not even read it, but what does it want to tell me? So in a way, I think what differentiates the philosophical perspective, which we need, from the educators and educated didactic research perspective, is that we need to think about not only how do we best get it into the students' heads, but how we develop that. And that, I think, is a very, very, it's our own perspective maybe, which integrates all these, not additively, but uses them. And maybe that answers this, this question of we and of how do we use it.
Thank you. I mean, I think I agree with everything you said. Yes, I mean, I think maybe, and I particularly like what you're saying about understanding each other rather than understanding the past. I mean, I think that maybe that's consistent with a focus on uses of the past. You know, I mean, what is it people are doing when they talk about the past? How do the different ways of talking work as language games or procedures or even social structures? All of those things are really interesting. And I agree with you, of course, that there's going to be great diversity. This is what's wrong with taking a purely cognitive approach to children's thinking or to adults thinking. Of course, it's culturally mediated, isn't it? So in any society, there'll be lots of different approaches, and the kids that come to your class will be bringing different ontologies even, or different epistemologies, or different assumptions about importance, criteria of relevance, all sorts of things. So whichever way we look at it, it's going to be really complicated. Yep, and I like what you're saying about relating things together as well. I just haven't got my head around exactly what that is yet. But, so I agree with you. I'm sorry, I always agree with you, Andreas. I should disagree one day.
All right, there are currently no other questions anymore. And I guess we already have gone on quite some time. So thank you very much again, Arthur, for giving us this presentation.
Pleasure. Thank you so much
for everything. Two small things before we stop. Again, we will stay here for a little chat for those of you interested. And our next event will be the 29th of April. We'll have Paul Roth giving a talk. He was already mentioned in here too. So please, if you're interested, follow our social media and join us. And then thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.